Hi everyone, welcome to week 7 of this course on theoretical perspectives and key ideas. It's actually week 6, but we call it week 7 because we skipped a week due to the reading week at UCL. So we're deep into this course, and actually this session is, in my mind at least, the last session in which, if you like, we are covering the bases of anthropological and more broadly social theory. So we've looked at some really big concepts, theoretical approaches founded in the idea of society, in the idea of culture, the idea of materiality, of structure. So we've looked at these very big figures, Durkheim, Marx, Lévi-Strauss, and so on. And today we carry on doing the same. The big figure for today is Max Weber, that other great sociologist, in this case German. And our theme is that of agency and power. As of next week, we'll start looking at more critical perspectives, in some ways more contemporary in the development of anthropological theory. But this, as I say, is the last week in which we're kind of covering the bases of social and specifically anthropological theory, or social theory more broadly, and its impact and refraction in anthropological theorizing and research, which is basically how we're approaching this whole course. So agency and power for this week. You may notice that these terms correspond to certain critical points that I've been making in previous lectures with regard to the approaches that we've been looking at already, where I talked about approaches that focus too much on kind of societal structures or cultural configurations, or indeed, in the case of Lévi-Strauss that we saw last week, deep structures, underlying symbolic and conceptual structures, all of which somehow impinge upon individual human beings as they go about their lives. They provide the coordinates or the terms in which people do what they do, think what they think, and so on. And approaches that lay emphasis on these kinds of structural, in a broader sense of the word structure, conditions of human life can often be criticized for laying too much power on these structures and not allowing enough space, as we saw, for precisely individual agency. And the power that human beings, as actors, as agents, might have to resist these structural conditions, or to overcome them, or to distort them, or to subvert them, or to be creative with them, and so on, right? So there is this perennial tussle. I don't know about perennial, but anyway, from the 19th century, arguably much earlier, but since our course started roughly with kind of the 19th century origins of the discipline of anthropology as a professional discipline, from then onwards, there's this tussle between what's known as structure on the one hand and agency on the other. And in some ways, with Marxism, with Durkheim, with Lévi-Strauss, we've been emphasizing, and also with Geertz, with the notion of culture, we've been emphasizing the structure side of things so far. So this is the week in which we push back in terms of this 20th century, very 20th century kind of distinction, and take the viewpoint of agency and look at the power effects that need to be considered when taking the viewpoint of human beings as agents. Right? Now, ultimately, my own view is that distinction between structure and agency is itself possibly one to be overcome. It's even perhaps a little bit passé, if one may say so, from the vantage of the early 21st century in which we now sit. It was very much a concern in social theory, as I say, in the 20th century. It continues to reverberate, and these issues constantly come up still. But somehow, theoretically, I think there are positions that go beyond this distinction today that are available to us. But since the point of this course is to acquaint you with the kind of rudiments of social theorizing, I think it's massively important for you to be aware of this question of agency and power, and seeing human beings as actors, even at the kind of individual, personal level. And just in saying that, in mentioning the word individual, I just wanted to say one good thing about this approach, and then one bad thing, one critical thing, both of which hinge on this relationship or this virtue that these approaches make of the individual as an agent. So the good thing I wanted to say is that for us as anthropologists, an approach that gives credit and allows us to engage constructively, positively with people as they go about their lives, and not seeing them merely as ciphers for underlying or overbearing structures that determine or otherwise constrain their lives, is actually a good thing. Because as anthropologists, that's what we deal with. We deal with people. We do field work. We engage in personal social relationships. I do field work in Cuba. I've been doing it for 20 years now, or more. I can't even remember. More actually, yeah. Coming up for 25 years now. And of course, I have deep, long-standing relationships and friendships and issues and, all the human stuff that you might have with individual people who have names, right? Who are my interlocutors. But they're also, my social circle in Cuba, in Havana, where I work, right? The same goes for all anthropologists. So to adopt a theoretical approach that somehow effaces those people as individuals, as flesh and blood human beings with desires, with wishes, with dreams, with fears, and so on, and puts all the emphasis on the kind of structural conditioning of these people, is unsatisfactory for me. So from that kind of methodological, anthropological commitment to people, a social theoretical approach that emphasizes human agency and individuality is an attractive one, right? So that's one important thing to say. A kind of more negative or critical thing to say, as I always do in these kinds of opening clips, I kind of put my cards on the table, as I say, declare my own position a little bit with regard to what we're talking about. The discomfort I have with some of these approaches is very similar to the discomfort that I had with regard to the approach based on the notion of culture, which is that individualism, note that I add the ism at the end, so the valorization of the individual is something that is very characteristic of European, perhaps even Euro-American, one might say, historical trajectories, right? The value of the individual, the freedom of the individual, the emphasis on individual creativity, on authorship, on autonomy. All of these are, if you like, cardinal values of European Enlightenment culture. In some ways, you might say that the French Revolution was also an individualist revolution. A person worth reading on this, by the way, is the great French anthropologist and thinker Louis Dumont, who talks about the development of individualism in European culture from an anthropological point of view, or in European society and tradition and intellectual traditions, as well as social and cultural practices. The individual is our cardinal value. So as an anthropologist, I'm always a little bit worried if we build in, for the usual reasons, to put it very crudely, the danger of ethnocentrism. You build in a local value, something that comes out of your own, if you are European, which I am, tradition of thinking. You build that into the infrastructure of a discipline that is supposed, in my view, the discipline of anthropology is supposed to be open and vulnerable to other possibilities for thinking, other ways of constituting what is important and what isn't, right? So if you build your own assumptions about what is important, in this case the assumption that individuals and their agency and freedom is massively important, into the infrastructure of anthropology, you kind of tilt it and you color it in a particular way. You give it a particular hue, a particular kind of texture that kind of constrains your theorizing and creates blind spots when you engage with ways of thinking that might go beyond that. And those ways of thinking don't necessarily need to be beyond Europe. There might be, and I know in fact that there are, ways of thinking and operating within Europe, within France, within Britain, within London, within Paris, wherever you want to localize the origins of these thoughts, in which individualism is not the kind of value that it is elevated to be in Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment European philosophy and social theory and thinking, right? So I'm not saying that it's only ethnocentric with regards to other societies or cultures that are non-European. I'm also saying that within the study of Europe itself, of the United States, of wherever you care to look at, you find social configurations, ways of living that people engage with, in which individualism is not the fundamental value. So that's my discomfort with building these kinds of valorizing concepts into our theoretical infrastructure as anthropologists. Okay, I leave it there for this clip, and I'll see you in the next clip where we'll kind of come to the core ideas of the approach that we're discussing this week as usual. See you there.